Hey, let me set the table back to where we are, so you can at least, in the way I see things, you'll see, where we are, and I'll pick back up from then. In chapter 9, verses 1 to 12, that the fifth trumpet sounds, which unleashes demonic locusts, and this is the first of the three terrible woes that were announced. And then in chapter 9, verses 13 to 21, the sixth trumpet sounds, which unleashes this demonic or fiendish cavalry. Now, this is the second of the three terrible woes that were announced. And then in chapter 10, verses 6 to 7, a mighty angel swears that it's time for the seventh angel to sound his trumpet, and that when it sounded, the mystery of God will be fulfilled, meaning his redemptive purpose for creation will be complete, which includes the final outpouring of his wrath, the third woe that is associated with the seventh trumpet. But before the seventh trumpet is sounded in chapter 11, verse 15, John, in chapter 11, verses 1 to 13, he previews the destiny of the church in the final days. It will proclaim Christ in a world of hostility and persecution, and then be ferociously attacked and seemingly decimated. Christ will then return, and his wrath will be fully poured out. The inhabitants of the earth at that time, those who oppose and persecute the church, they will be punished temporally, and then they and all the unsaved throughout history will be punished eternally by consignment to hell. Now, in chapter 11, verse 14, John brings us back and he reminds us that the third woe of the seventh trumpet is still coming, that final expression of God's wrath. And then 11:15, the seventh trumpet, the third woe, as we're told in chapter 8, verse 13, it sounded, but unlike the woes that accompanied the fifth and sixth trumpets, there's no description of divine wrath. There's nothing comparable to the demonic locusts with the fifth trumpet, or the fiendish cavalry with the sixth trumpet being unleashed. There's nothing like that. Instead, we're given a picture of the eternal state that comes after the completion of God's wrath. So here the seventh angel sounds his trumpet. The third woe, we're waiting for a comparable description of the worst of all woes. And instead, we jump ahead to the eternal state. And we get that description there. And as the readers were left asking, well, what about the divine wrath that is the third woe? And as I said, that won't be reported until chapters 15 and 16. And when it is, it's presented as the outpouring of 7 bowls of wrath. That's how the third woe of the seventh trumpet comes out. Here's what Wist Fanning says in his commentary. He says, with the trumpet blast from the seventh angel, verse 15a, the series of trumpets that began in 8:2-7 is completed, but just as the opening of the seventh seal in 8:1 signaled no immediate judgments, unlike the first 6 seals, so no explicit judgments follow the seventh trumpet blast. Instead, the 7 bowls that eventually follow in chapters 15 and 16 will fill out the judgments of the seventh trumpet as the 7 trumpets fill out the seventh seal. And that's what I think is going on. That's what I think is happening. But before the effect of the seventh trumpet in the form of the 7 bowls of wrath, before that's revealed in chapters 15 and 16, we are given in chapters 12 through 14 a spiritual summary of the history of the world from the beginning of Christ until the end. This spiritual summary of history from Christ's coming until the end. And having represented the final state and then backed up to the brink of the final woe, the completion of God's wrath, John is made to pause to reveal the spiritual forces at work in this struggle that is played out on earth. That's what I think is happening in 12 to 14. Now, I sympathize with Jim's comment to me after the class last week, where he said he'd prefer the vision to be chronological rather than jumping here and backing up and this kind of thing. I sympathize with that. But as best I can tell, it's not that way. You see, it seems to be moving the way that I'm describing it to you. All right, chapter 12, 1 to 6. A great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. She was pregnant and was crying out in birth pains and the agony of giving birth. And another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his head 7 diadems, royal crowns. His tail swept down 1/3 of the stars of heaven and cast them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she bore her child, he might devour it. She gave birth to a male child, one who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. But her child was caught up to God and to his throne. And the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by God, in which she is to be nourished for 1,260 days. Now we have this great sign appears in heaven. And it's a woman who's clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and a crown of 12 stars on her head. And she is in the pain of childbirth. Now, it's a sign because that woman is a symbol of something, as is the woman on the beast in chapter 17. It is a great sign in that the woman is a symbol of something of great significance in the purposes of God. She symbolizes true Israel, faithful Israel, the covenant community giving birth to the Messiah. Now, Jesus, of course, is a Jew, meaning he was born within that community of faith, the people of God, Israel. He's born there. And verse 5 leaves no doubt as to the identity of the child this woman is delivering. It says she gave birth to a male child, one who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. And in Psalm 2, it is the Messiah who will rule the nations with an iron rod. And Psalm 2 was understood messianically and by the early church and applied to Jesus the Messiah. So she is giving birth to the Messiah. And the portrait of Israel as a woman is a familiar one in Scripture. You see it, for example, in Isaiah chapter 50, verse 1, chapter 54, verses 1 to 6, Jeremiah chapter 2, verse 2, Jeremiah 4:31, Ezekiel 16, 6 to 14, Micah chapter 4, verses 9 and 10, and I'm sure other places. And that this woman's identity as Israel. So you have Israel is often portrayed as a woman in Scripture, but that this woman is in fact Israel, that idea is reinforced by the inclusion of the 12 stars. Those 12 stars, which probably is rooted in Joseph's dream in Genesis chapter 37. You remember where his brothers are 11 stars and they're bowing down to him? Now, Joseph in that dream is not there described as a star, but a first century Jewish writer, a man named Philo. Philo says in his writings that he refers to Joseph as the 12th star. Okay, so this idea that this woman has the 12 stars, the 12 sons of Israel, You see, that's something that is understood. Grant Osborne, in his commentary, says, in Jewish literature, 12 stars often refers to the 12 patriarchs or the 12 tribes. And the references to the sun and moon regarding this woman probably speak of faithful Israel's glory in God's sight. Now, though the interpretation is disputed, there are a number of scholars who they believe that one of the Thanksgiving hymns from the Dead Sea Scrolls, the scrolls that were found at Qumran by this sect of Judaism, the Essenes. Well, there is a Thanksgiving hymn that a number of scholars say it pictures the faithful community as a woman, Mother Zion, enduring birth pains until she gives birth to a male child, the messianic deliverer of God's people. Well, if that understanding of those scholars of that hymn is correct, well, that obviously would be in line with what I'm suggesting to you is being pictured by this woman here. And then another sign appears in heaven, this enormous red dragon with 7 heads, 10 horns, and 7 crowns. He's there and he's waiting to devour this woman's child. And verse 4 says, his tail swept down 1/3 of the stars of heaven and cast them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth so that when she bore her child, he might devour it. And the dragon is specifically identified in verse 9 as that ancient serpent called the devil or Satan. And interestingly, in Ezekiel chapter 29, verse 3, and chapter 32, verse 2, those texts refer to Pharaoh, the enemy of God's people, as a dragon. And Gregory Beale, in his commentary, says, the devil is the force behind the wicked kingdoms who persecute God's people. Now, Satan sought to destroy Jesus from the moment of his birth, right? So here in this imagery is Satan as this red dragon. He's before the woman giving birth to the Messiah. He's waiting to destroy this child, to devour this child. And Satan sought to destroy Jesus right from jump. You remember Herod the Great, right? He was so obsessed with killing the baby Jesus that when the wise men didn't return to inform him of the child's whereabouts, what did he do? He slaughtered all the children in the area who were 2 years old and under. You see in Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 to 18. So he was in a rage to kill him. So much so that when they didn't come back, he says, well, I'm going to see if I can get him this way. I'll kill everybody. 2 and under. Well, that's the picture. But Jesus was protected by God. Then, and throughout his earthly ministry, you remember the attempt of the crowd to throw him off the cliff in Luke chapter 4, verses 28 to 39? They're all there. They got him. They got the drop on right there. And what's it? And Jesus just walked through the crowd. So he was protected not only then, but throughout his earthly ministry until the time of his crucifixion, which was according to God's plan, as you see in Acts chapter 2, verse 23. So he's protected from these forces after him, and then in God's plan, okay, and then he's crucified. But that was, I say, according to God's plan. And thereafter, he was, as indicated in the second part, Jesus, in the second part of chapter verse 5, he was caught up to God and to his throne. So we've got Satan here waiting to devour him when he's born. Next thing we go, he's caught up to God and to his throne. And as Grant Osborne says in his commentary, he says, the narrative omits all details of Christ's life, ministry, and death and moves directly from his birth to his ascension. So here we are, ready getting, and then all of a sudden, he's ascended to heaven. He's called up. And it's that ascension, you see, the resurrection and the exaltation to the right hand of God, which summarizes Christ's victory. That is the summary of his victory over the enemy, the dragon's attempt to thwart God's plan involving the Messiah was completely and utterly defeated. God prevented Satan from killing Jesus before God's time. He protected him, prevented him from doing that, killing him before his time. And the crucifixion that Satan thought was his long-sought victory was in fact his defeat. Right? He's playing chess with somebody who's playing on like 3, 4, 5 dimensions. We would say God beat Satan like a drum. He thinks, I've got him. I've got him. You see, I just think of like the bullfighter. You see, just there you go. You thinking you have something. So in all of that, it just goes to God's glory. His greatness. God is always triumphant. And the dragon's appearance, it symbolizes a number of things. The color red, it represents his murderous character. You see, especially as expressed against the people of God. In John chapter 8, verse 44, Jesus called Satan a murderer from the beginning. And the 7 heads and 10 horns, those are probably intended to give a picture of the fullness of the creature's evil and power. You see, horns are a sign of power, and you can see where that would come from, whether it's on a steer or a rhino. You see, horns are a sign of power. And evil beasts are depicted elsewhere in antiquity as having a multiplicity of heads, including Leviathan in Psalm 74, verse 14. Now that may be a sign of their immense vitality. And the fact the beast out of the sea, as we will see in chapter 13, verse 1, also has 7 heads and 10 horns, suggests that he shares Satan's nature, which fits with the understanding of that beast as Antichrist, as the Satan-inspired enemy of God and his people. And the greatness of the dragon's power, it's also reflected in his enormous size and his ability to sweep 1/3 of the stars from the sky. And the sweeping of the stars so it says something about his power. But his sweeping of the stars from the sky may also symbolize the original fall of some angels when they, under Satan's leadership, first rebelled against God. And the result of that turning from God was the perversity and the viciousness and the wickedness that has since characterized demons. So that may be part of the imagery. And I think the royal crowns, they represent Satan's presumptuous claim of sovereignty over the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, upon whose head are many crowns. You see in chapter 19, verse 12 and 16. Right? Satan is called the prince of this world. You see in John 12:31, 14:30, 16:11. He's called the ruler of the kingdom of the air. In Ephesians chapter 2, verse 2. And he's called the God of this world, or of this age. In 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 4. He's called those things because he's allowed for now to have a certain level of influence in the world, but he is not sovereign. He is not sovereign. He's already been defeated. And his miserable end is certain. It is a fact. Now, there's a brief reference in verse 6 to the fact the woman will be cared for, nourished by God during the days of her persecution, which is represented by that standard 1,260 days, or 42 months, or times and half a time. But she's going to be cared for by God during that time. And the image of the wilderness brings up this notion of God's providential care in times of hardship, as you have with manna during the Exodus. And this theme of care in the wilderness that's rooted in Exodus, it's also echoed in texts like 1 Kings chapter 19, verses 4 to 8, which deals with Elijah's flight from Jezebel. So this anticipates, see, this idea of hardship and persecution and God's protection, this anticipates the discussion in verses 13 to 17, but verses 7 to 12 reveal the spiritual background of that persecution. So we're going to see that persecution that's alluded to here, but we're going to see the spiritual background of that persecution in verses 7 to 12. It says, "Now war arose in heaven, Michael and his angels fighting against the dragon. And the dragon and his angels fought back, but he was defeated, and there was no longer any place for them in heaven. And the great dragon was thrown down, that ancient serpent who is called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. And I heard a loud voice in heaven saying, 'Now the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Christ have come, for the accuser of our brothers has been thrown down, who accuses them day and night before God. And they have conquered him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, for they love not their lives even unto death. Therefore rejoice, O heavens, and you who dwell in them. But woe to you, O earth and sea, for the devil has come down to you in great wrath, because he knows that his time is short.'" So the defeat of Satan effectuated, brought about by the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus Christ, that defeat is symbolized in the expulsion from heaven of Satan and his angels. Now, this may be the victory that Jesus foresaw in Luke chapter 10, verse 18, when he said he saw Satan fall like lightning from the sky. You see, in the context of the 72 rejoicing over Christ's power over demons, Christ alludes to the ultimate victory ahead, the ultimate breaking of Satan's power, which was accomplished in his work at the cross. And verse 10 then links this expulsion, Satan's expulsion from heaven, it links it to the inauguration of the kingdom of God, accomplished most fundamentally in Jesus' death, his resurrection, and his ascension. It clearly refers to the inauguration, okay? The first bring where Christ comes and he inaugurates or initiates the kingdom at his first coming. It refers to that rather than to the finalization or the consummation of his kingdom that is the eternal state that will come about when Jesus returns. We can know that because the expulsion of Satan is associated with Satan making war. When he comes down, he makes war against the church. As we see, so after he's expelled, that expulsion is tied to this kingdom coming. He comes down and then he has this war that he makes against the church. And there will be no war against the church. There will be no persecution in the consummated kingdom, in the eternal state. There will be no death, no sorrow, no mourning, no suffering, no pain, no crying, none of that. So see, that tells you that what is referred to here is this breaking of Satan came with the inauguration of the kingdom, with Christ's work in his coming, his ministry, his death, his resurrection, and his ascension. That's it for Satan. It's a fait accompli. Okay, he's done. And in the vision, the expulsion's carried out by Michael and his angels. But Michael is merely executing or administering the victory that was won by Christ at Calvary. See, his action is, as Beale says, a heavenly reflection of what Christ does on earth. As John says in 1 John chapter 3, verse 8, Christ appeared to destroy the works of the devil. That's his victory. And it's simply being administered in the vision in Michael throwing Satan down. And Satan apparently had some type of access to heaven and continually accused the saints of disobedience. And you can see that kind of thing in Job chapter 1, verses 9 to 11, Zechariah chapter 3, verse 1. Perhaps Satan was tolerated in that role because God recognized the justice of those allegations, that those people are sinful, that those people do deserve wrath. But with the atoning death of Jesus, with his appearance in history, with his atoning death, God's justice has been satisfied on the historical stage. So Satan's accusations are no longer even listened to, no longer tolerated. He's thus expelled from heaven. You see, that the justice, yes, it says, I hear you, but you've been shown, you see, that this is nonsense because the wrath they owed has been drunk by the Lord Jesus Christ. Okay, so that's what I think is there. He ultimately is powerless. Satan ultimately is powerless against Christians because the victory has been won. And the angel then announces in verse 11 that Christians, our brothers, in verse 10, she's showing the angel's identification with Christians as fellow servants. But he says, it announces in verse 10 that Christians have conquered Satan, the accuser, and they conquered him by means of Christ's sacrifice, which the benefits and blessings of which they appropriate through a steadfast faith, through genuine faith, through saving faith, through biblical faith. They appropriate it through that kind of faith that confesses him even at the risk of their lives. You see? For they love not their lives, even unto death. Right? As Jesus told the angel of the church in Smyrna in Revelation chapter 2, verse 10, do not fear what you're about to suffer. Behold, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison that you may be tested, and for 10 days you will have tribulation. Be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life. So this is what he's talking about. It is by Christ's work that we receive and appropriate through genuine saving faith. And because of Christ's victory and the participation of the saints in that victory, the voice calls on heaven's inhabitants to rejoice. But this same victory, it means distress for God's people on earth. Right? The persecution that John's readers were enduring at that time, that persecution they were enduring and the persecution that will arise at the end, it's not because Satan is too strong. It's because he's been defeated. It's because he's been defeated. He is in his death throes. Right? He's in his death throes because he's been defeated by Christ. He knows, as we would put it, his days are numbered. He's living on borrowed time. 13 to 17a. And when the dragon saw that he'd been thrown down to the earth, he pursued the woman who had given birth to the male child. But the woman was given 2 wings of the great eagle so that she might fly from the serpent into the wilderness to the place where she is to be nourished for a time and times and half a time. The serpent poured out water like a river out of his mouth after the woman to sweep her away with a flood. But the earth came to the help of the woman, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed the river that the dragon had poured out from his mouth. He just can't get a break, can he? And it says here, then the dragon became furious with the woman and went off to make war on the rest of her offspring, on those who keep the commandments of God and hold to the testimony of Jesus. So here we have some serious stuff going down. All right, knowing that God, through Christ, has defeated him, that he's living on borrowed time, so to speak. Satan persecutes the woman who gave birth to Christ, meaning he persecutes true Israel, which is the messianic community. Right? Following Christ's coming, true Israel consisted. Right? True Israel, I've said this many times, true Israel, it's not simply all of ethnic Israel. It's not all those who are descended from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Paul in other places makes it clear that no. True Israel is a subset of ethnic Israel. True Israel are those Israelites who have the faith of Abraham, who believe what God says. So this community from which Christ is birthed, true Israel, after Christ's coming, true Israel are those ethnic Jews who believe God's testimony about who Jesus is. So they are the initial Jewish church. They are the Jewish root that Paul in Romans 11 says the Gentiles are later grafted into. All right, so she's the community that gives birth, and she is the initial church. So she's the messianic community both before and after Christ. She is faithful Israel, which after Christ's coming is the church. Now, of course, the church, as I say, in the beginning was exclusively Jewish, and at the very beginning it was confined to Jerusalem. Right? That's where the church began. These are Jewish believers in Jesus there in Jerusalem. And the original Jewish church was the focus of intense persecution by unbelieving Jews, by Jews who were not part of true Israel, Jews who denied God's testimony about who Jesus is, showed themselves not to be true Israel, by unbelieving Jews, and by Herod, and the church was persecuted for a period of time. Symbolized there in the 1,260 days and the times and half a time. But the church was protected by God from Satan's assault, was protected by God from destruction, though individual Christians certainly died. Right? They certainly died. Acts chapter 4 through Acts chapter 12 record this persecution of the initial church there in Jerusalem. Now, later chapters of Acts reveal that there's an established Christian center in Jerusalem. So Satan had failed to stamp it out. Here is this Messiah born. Here is the Christian community in Jerusalem. Here is the woman there. Satan rages against her. He's been cast down. His days are numbered. He tries to destroy her. He tries to kill her. You see it in Acts. Raging. God protects the church. So what do we see later? We see, well, there's an established center right there. How's that possible when Satan was bent on destroying it? Well, God protected it. He kept him from destroying it. He couldn't do it because God didn't allow him to do it. So you understand? So Satan had failed to stamp it out, and instead, that church, right, that original Jewish root, that Jewish nucleus, instead it spread or reproduced to the ends of the earth, in the words of Acts chapter 1, verse 8. Okay, so having failed to destroy or stamp out the original Christian community, Satan then turned his attention to the offspring of that original Christian community. He failed to stamp it out there, and then he turns his attention to its offspring, the Christians and churches that were spawned by that original community. Those who obey God's commandments and hold to the testimony of Jesus. Right? I mean, there's no secret about who we're talking about here. So they were the offspring of that original community. Because as it spread, you had other people coming to Christ. He failed to crush it there, and then he turns his attention to other churches. And the churches in Asia, to which John is writing in the mid-90s, they were experiencing the dragon's war. They were experiencing, and he's telling them, this is what's going on behind the scenes. I'm lifting the curtain and letting you see the spiritual realities of what are going on. You are enduring the dragon's war. He's raging. And that's what you're facing. And the final generation will experience the last great spasm of Satan's fury. They will experience that. And the vision now moves, the way I see it, the vision now moves to that final battle. It now moves to that final battle. In 12:17b through 13:10. And he stood on the sand of the sea. And I saw a beast rising out of the sea with 10 horns and 7 heads, with 10 diadems on its horns, and blasphemous names on its heads. And the beast that I saw was like a leopard. Its feet were like a bear's, and its mouth was like a lion's mouth. And to it, the dragon gave his power and his throne and great authority. One of its heads seemed to have a mortal wound, but its mortal wound was healed, and the whole earth marveled as they followed the beast. And they worshiped the dragon, for he had given his authority to the beast, and they worshiped the beast, saying, "Who is like the beast, and who can fight against it?" And the beast was given a mouth uttering haughty and blasphemous words, and it was allowed to exercise authority for 42 months. It opened its mouth to utter blasphemies against God, blaspheming his name and his dwelling, that is, those who dwell in heaven. Also, it was allowed to make war on the saints and to conquer them. And authority was given to it over every tribe and people and language and nation. And all who dwell on earth will worship it, everyone whose name has not been written before the foundation of the world in the book of life of the Lamb who was slain. If anyone has an ear, let him hear. If anyone is taken captive, to captivity he goes. If anyone is to be slain with the sword must he be slain. Here is a call for the endurance and faith of the saints. Indeed it is. Right? I mean, you listen to this? It's definitely a call for endurance. Now, there are differences in versification of the phrase, "and he stood on the sand of the sea," that follows the phrase, "hold to the testimony of Jesus" in chapter 12, verse 17. You have it's versed differently. Okay, so you have a number of translations that say, "and he stood on the sand of the sea," as they make that the last clause of chapter 12, verse 17. Others make it chapter 12, verse 18. And others make it the first clause of chapter 13, verse 1. But you understand that the versification and the chapter headings, they come much later. Okay? They're not part of what is being written down by the inspired writer. So you have differences in where does this belong in terms of versification. Now, there's no time link between chapter 12, verse 17a, the first part of 17, and this clause, "and he stood on the sand of the sea." So having shown the reason, having shown the spiritual reason for Satan's fury, in my view, my judgment, the vision then moves to the final act of history. And Satan stands on the seashore, awaiting or summoning the beast who will be Satan's agent in the final assault on the church. So he stands on the seashore, either waiting or beckoning and calling for this beast who will be his agent in this assault. And John sees a beast rising out of the sea. And in chapter 11, verse 7, the beast was said to come from the abyss. But as I pointed out there, the origin of that notion abyss as a place of demonic incarceration, the origin of that was the unfathomable depths of the sea. That's where abyss comes from. So these are the same images, just put differently. In fact, Osborne says the two images are synonymous. So here comes this beast from a bad place. This is where he's coming from. And the beast John saw had 7 heads and 10 horns, like the dragon. Right? But unlike the dragon, its crowns were on its horns instead of on its heads, and thus it had 10 crowns instead of 7. Grant Osborne, he says, primarily the imagery of the 7 heads and 10 horns parallels the description. You see, they're two distinctive entities, right? We have the dragon who is Satan, and then we have his agent, this beast. And he says primarily the image of the 7 heads and 10 horns parallels the description of the dragon, showing that the beast is united with the dragon and yet has a separate role. So he's definitely a Satan-inspired, Satan-influenced, completely down with Satan thing. And that's who he is. But the symbolism of the beast's heads and horns and crowns, that'll be developed further in chapter 17. Now the beast has blasphemous names on its heads. And this is an indication that, like the little horn, I don't know how much you remember when we went through Daniel, like the little horn in Daniel chapter 7, verse 25, he will speak against the Most High. That's his blasphemous names. That's going to be his modus operandi. He's going to speak like this. And as Grant Osborne says, his blasphemous claims to deity. He's going to actually say that, hey, I'm divine. And demands to be worshipped in place of God and Christ form the core of his hideous work. So, and I heard that bell, but you already, you see, when John talks about even now many antichrists, those who share this spirit to a lesser extent, even now many have come. Well, you were already seeing this kind of thing in Roman emperors who were declaring they were divine and you needed to worship them. And so what you're going to get with the rise of Antichrist at the end is something like that on steroids. Going to be claiming I'm divine, and you're going to be worshiping me. You see, and that's going to be this beast who is a Satan-animated opponent of God and his people. Thanks for hanging.